Good evening, everyone. It's a little bit past 5:30. Thank you for joining us. This is State Representative Lindsay LaPointe of the 19th House District. And I am here tonight sitting in my office in the wonderful Gladstone Park neighborhood in the 39th Ward of Chicago. And this is going to be a really cool town hall. We're going to cover a lot of stuff. We're going to cover some basics of where we are in Springfield and where we are in the legislative process, what I even do as a state rep. We're going to cover legislation that's on the table for this spring, especially some things that I am leading, which as a new legislator, I'm very excited about. And of course, we're going to take questions. And I am so thrilled to have my co-pilot tonight be Mary Oshana, who is from Skokie, so she's not too far away. And first of all, it's great because you don't want to hear one person just talking at you, but Mary is somebody I met in the course of work as a state representative. She is incredibly involved in the Assyrian American community. And during the pandemic, which of course we are still in a public health and economic crisis, we are doing constituent services in overdrive, and a lot of people are struggling. And we connected with Mary because we needed some assistance with our Assyrian constituents, and Mary was working with people and she helped connect to our office. So I'll let Mary say a few things about herself, and I'm just so pleased that you're with me tonight.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that intro, Lindsay, and I'm honored to be your co-pilot this evening. Thank you all for joining Lindsay. She is an absolute rock star, and I can't say enough wonderful things about Lindsay. Just touching base briefly, I know Lindsay has a lot to get through this evening, so I won't hold you too long in about me, but working with Lindsay over the COVID-19 pandemic was such a tremendous help and aid to us while we all are now navigating the snow and unshoveling ourselves out of the snow. We can look back and remember a time when we were scrambling for figuring out the unemployment process. And with that said, the difficulties that came with the COVID-19 process and unemployment. So Lindsay was a huge aid to the community in that way. And I can't say enough great things about your office and your team. Thank you again for having me, Lindsay.
Absolutely. And thanks for mentioning my team, because as we all know, nobody does anything alone. And the team that I have, Jessica, Alex, Maisie, we all work together to help people meet the needs that they have.
Absolutely. And they deserve those accolades. Absolutely. So I guess before we jump in, Lindsay, before we talk about legislation, I think it would be helpful to give folks on the call a quick orientation. What is the role of a state representative, and how much of what you do is related to legislation?
Great question. And what I have to remind myself, even though I'm in the thick of it every day, is that a lot of people out there don't know who their state representative is, and certainly don't know kind of all the things that a state rep or a state senator does. More often than not, people will know who their alderman is, and they'll know what an alderman does. And if people do know what a state rep is, they think about going to Springfield and taking votes and leading legislation. And that's, in some ways, that's the core of the job. And we certainly do that. But the other parts of the job that a lot of people don't know about, there's two other parts of the job, and everything fits together. One is constituent services. So every state legislative office plays a role in connecting constituents, and in every House district in Illinois, there's 108,000 constituents, connecting to state services, helping to be a liaison with state agencies which can range anywhere from the Illinois Department of Employment Security to something called IDPFR, which I'm going to mess this up, the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. There, I got it. And they do all the state licenses. So social workers, nurses, real estate agents, there's a lot going on there. So if anyone hits a bump in the road in dealing with state agencies, which you will, right? That's just the nature of big bureaucracies and getting through to people. Your state legislator should always be somebody that you can reach out to help you navigate. So that's the constituent services. And then the other part of the job is outreach. And that is making sure we are out there in the community. And part of that is communicating about our role, helping to navigate state agencies and state services, but making sure we are being present and accessible, so we have an ear to the ground for what issues are happening. And that, of course, should feed our legislative agenda and what we're going to vote yes on, what we're going to vote no on, what we're going to lead, what we're going to sit in many meetings on to move forward to make the state work for more people. So those are kind of the basics, like the legislating, constituent services, and outreach. And I'm sure if you follow me on Facebook, you see some of those community events that we are doing and adapting to in this, what feels like never-ending pandemic.
Definitely. I would say your Facebook, you are very active. I highly recommend your constituents and non-constituents to take a look at Lindsay's Facebook. She's visiting small businesses, and definitely inspirational to see all the work that you do, Lindsay. Before we jump in and continue, I just want to point out my awesome shirt from your office. And it goes well with a blazer, everyone. Highly recommend it. But yeah, going back to the working in Springfield and not in Springfield, what are the types of things legislators do when they aren't in Springfield?
A lot. And it's funny because I think we've all seen it, especially during this time of COVID, which is ironic because there's much more constituent work to do during this crisis. But we've seen narratives out there of like, oh, you're not in Springfield in session, you're not working, which is hilarious if you know anything about what we do. Well, first and foremost, there are these basic things that we have to do as part of the job. But as with any community leader, whether you're elected or not, the role is what you make it. So there's always some of that going on. And so every legislator treats the role a little bit differently. We all have things we have been historically passionate about. But let me give you a few examples, because although I was in Springfield for one day last week, for the most part, we haven't been in Springfield. So I'll just shed some light on things we work on. Number one, here's a great example that I've been fairly public about. If you live in Chicago, you know about the Chicago public schools, for the most part, not being reopened during the pandemic. And there was a rollout plan in place where we started with pre-K and cluster programs, and then K through 8 students were ready to come back. But there was a lot of disagreement between the Chicago Teachers Union and the mayor and Chicago Public Schools. And I got a lot of feedback about that from residents of the 19th House District. I sat in a lot of briefings with the Chicago Teachers Union and with CPS and the mayor about it's a little bit behind the scenes, kind of what are the big outstanding issues, and we always have an opportunity to ask questions during those briefings. A bunch of us legislators in Chicago, after sitting through briefings and having lots of conversations with our constituents and especially our teachers and our parents, we decided to make a public statement and put a letter together and put that out there. And we did that a few weeks ago, and you might have seen that that's something the alderman had already did, which in some ways makes more sense. This is a city issue. You would expect the aldermen to weigh in faster, and they did. But being a leader, this is something that our constituents reach out to us as well. And in terms of education and in terms of CPS, there's a lot we do in Springfield that is directly related, including a bill related to restoring collective bargaining rights of the Chicago teachers, restoring them after a law passed in the late 90s that diminished those benefits. And that is actually pending on the governor's desk. You mentioned small businesses. Always, we do our best to lift up our small businesses, and this area has so many small business owners that live and work here. And to me, that's extra special, because when you choose to live and work in the same place and provide some sort of service, whether it is a restaurant, a brewery, a hardware store, a childcare center, that means a lot. So we do small business awards. We had a lot of fun on Tuesday, trudging through the snow and making a lot of deliveries of punchkis to many frontline workers, including libraries. And that was pretty fun, because librarians have been working throughout this pandemic, sometimes from home, now fully back in the libraries. And it was nice to recognize them too. And then I'll give one more example, which is something I just did this week. When we're in our offices, or in the district is the term that we tend to use, we're very frequently meeting with constituents and or other stakeholders, policy advocacy groups, so we can be educated about upcoming policy, upcoming legislation. Sometimes it's because someone's going to ask for us to vote yes or no on something. Sometimes it's a longer term effort, maybe a multi-year effort. Sometimes we'll be asked to lead a bill. And my most recent meeting that falls into this bucket was actually with the Illinois AARP, which is a group I'm sure you've all seen in the media. They have a great national presence, but they also have a great presence in Illinois and in Springfield, making sure that we have stability and full opportunities for people that are of retirement age. This group, Illinois AARP, in collaboration with other groups, recently put out a comprehensive and compelling policy report all about the disparities that exist with our older population, in particular racial disparities. And I wanted to meet with this group in particular because we have a significant older Asian American population in the 19th House District. The big takeaway is that disparities, in particular racial and economic disparities, increase over the lifespan. And we have a lot of good policy options on the table of how we can disrupt that disparity, change the course of those disparities by things like creating better savings plans for people, and doing better education on how people can start saving earlier in life. There's a bill I'm really excited about that I am a chief co-sponsor on, called the Senior Citizen Property Tax Deferral Program. And essentially it's a program that exists now, but it needs some tweaks so it works better for people. But if you're a senior citizen and your income is less than $55,000, then this is a program where you can defer your property taxes. And this has nothing to do with COVID. We did some extra things during COVID related to property tax deferrals, but as we know, we have seniors on fixed incomes that struggle even outside of the pandemic. So I'm really excited about that bill, and I was excited to see that it fit right into this robust research process that the Illinois AARP with partners had put together. That was a fun one from the last week. And I will give a special shout out. I said we have meetings with policy advocacy groups and constituents every once in a while, or actually maybe more often than every once in a while. There are policy advocates in Springfield that also live here in the district, and turns out that was the case with the Illinois AARP, so that was extra fun.
That's amazing. I've worked with the AARP, working at a delegate agency of the Chicago Cook Workforce Agency, and the direct benefits on the community that AARP has is tremendous. I worked on the workforce development side of it, and thank you for working for your constituents that need those resources, as you do for all your constituents, but particularly the senior citizens and especially the tax deferral that you mentioned. That's really tremendous. So Lindsay, you were a part of the original 19 legislators that paved the way for the first new Speaker of the House in more than 30 years. How do you see your roles and voices as House members changing the upcoming session? What insights do you have as to the kind of leader Speaker Welch hopes to be? And I know that's a two-part question, so if you want to tackle it the first, feel free, and I could ask the second again.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and some of this stuff is inside baseball. What is the leadership structure of the Illinois House? What rules govern how we do things? It might sound wonky, like it's why do we even need to know about this or care about it? But it's actually incredibly important, and who our leader is and how they operate will allow us as legislators to get things done or not. It'll allow us to communicate better or not. So I'm sure, as everybody knows, for about 36 years, we had, with the exception of a few years in there, when a Republican was the Speaker of the House, we've had one guy. And for a variety of reasons, at least initially 19 of us didn't think that was a good idea anymore. And for me, making a public statement, as I did way back in August, about how and why I think we need new leadership, for me, it was always about how I felt a deep mistrust of Illinois state government and politics. Frankly, I had a little bit of my own, and I heard that a lot from people, and there was just there became a point where there was just no question for me. We needed new leadership, and when I looked around to all of the Democrats in the Illinois House, I thought to myself, what an amazing group of people. What amazing leadership capacity we have in front of us. It doesn't have to be just one person. So that was kind of a part of the conversation of how we got here. Let's see, we've had a new speaker since mid-January. I can tell you already that the communication is very different. The communication is very consistent. It's more, and I'm talking about communication, for starters, just to House Democrats. I am thrilled that right now the House Democrats are having regular meetings weekly, which that might sound like a no-brainer, like, haven't you been doing that forever? And the answer is no. We actually did not meet as a caucus from May to January, when we were together in person in Springfield in May and January. And keep in mind, we're dealing with multiple crises here. So to me, that was a red flag that we weren't even meeting, and I'm just thrilled that we're meeting. I know, I've had several conversations with new Speaker Chris Welch, and one of his big goals is to make sure our caucus really works together and to make sure it's a place where we are supported, and to make sure that the Illinois House, and this is something that's really important to me, is a place where people can grow and where people can build their leadership capacity. And when you are in leadership, certainly when you're the speaker, you have a significant amount of power to assign things to people, to give people opportunities to do things like lead transformational big pieces of legislation, to serve on different working groups. And I can tell you unequivocally that our new speaker has already shown that not only is that a priority for him, but he's doing it. So he's showing it through action. So I'm pretty hopeful about getting back to a regular session in Springfield, so we can get a lot done, because we weren't able to get a lot done last year.
That's really great insight, Lindsay. Thank you.
One other thing I want to say about that, because I think a lot of people don't know this. When a lot of people, when they think Springfield, they think entrenched insiders, people that have been there for 30 years. And yeah, there's a handful of people that have been there 30 years, many of whom still do great things. But overall, Springfield has been changing, and more than half of the House Democrats have been there for less than 5 years. We have more women than men. We have a lot of younger people. I consider myself a young legislator. I'm just under 40, and yet we actually have a fair amount of legislators that are younger than me. So I'm like nowhere near the youngest person. We have a lot of racial diversity in both the House and the Senate. And I know it's a priority for our speaker and for many of us that we have an elected body that truly represents the diversity of Illinois. And so we are really getting there.
That's really wonderful to hear. And I know that there was some redistricting happening. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and how that impacts our community at large?
Yeah, great question. It's something that is complicated, and we've been hearing about in the media lately. So redistricting is the process that happens every 10 years after our, I think the right word is diennial, after our diennial census that happens every 10 years, where political electoral boundaries are redrawn. And there's a handful of things that govern or create the rules for how exactly we redistrict. Things like the state constitution, federal law. Illinois passed a law right after, about 10 years ago, right after the last census, the Illinois voting rights law. And all those things have components within them that govern how we have to do this redistricting. So what that means for you and what that means for me is we'll just use the 19th House District as an example. The exact boundaries of the 19th House District, and I'm at my office, and the northern boundary up here is Devon. If you're north of Devon, you are in a different House District. If you're south, you're in the 19th. All of those boundaries are going to be subject to some change as we go through this redistricting process. And there's a timeline laid out for the process, but of course the inputs or the data for the process is the census, and a lot changes in 10 years. People come, people go, immigrate, emigrate, have more babies, have less babies. So there's always change, and we know there's change this year, and it's going to be different because we are very behind on the census, and we don't have any concrete information yet about how the timeline is going to change, but we we have heard from the federal government that the numbers won't be all ready to go before September 30th. And why that's a huge hiccup, it's an understatement, is because we'll just take state reps, for example. We run for office every 2 years, and we start it's called the filing process right around Labor Day in every odd numbered year, which is this year. So how can you file papers saying you're going to run for office when you're not even sure exactly what House district you live in, because the redistricting isn't done yet? So stay tuned. I think we'll see some more in the media, but that's kind of those are the basics, and those are some of the hiccups, to put it lightly.
Those are really big hiccups because the census results were supposed to be ready for the president's review in April. So
that's right.
That's an immense gap between when they were supposed to be delivered for review and now what they're saying, which is September. That's definitely a hiccup. And my understanding of the census this year was that they had the most responses that they've ever had for the census, which is amazing. And we really look forward to that data to learn more about our communities and, like you said, the migration patterns. Can you explain the gerrymandering and what it is, and I guess who is in the district and what the borders look like? Can you give us more insight?
Yeah, well, gerrymandering, I recently learned that term came from a political leader from Massachusetts, like way back in the day, whose name was Jerry. But like most people have heard that term, and it means gerrymandering is like moving boundaries for political purposes. And another way of saying that, which we hear a lot in government and politics, is it's not the elected officials shouldn't choose their constituents or voters. I shouldn't be able to choose my voters choose me. So like I shouldn't be drawing my own political boundaries. But think back to what I said about how there are several things that govern this process: federal law, the Illinois Voting Rights Act, the state constitution, and there are things within those documents or within those pieces of those statutes that lay out principles. So, for instance, some of those principles are very much related to race or minority populations, and ensuring that people are properly represented. And some of the other components in those things are related to where natural boundaries occur, like things like rivers, or even I think things like train beds are included, so not exactly natural, but or a principle related to, if there's one neighborhood, we shouldn't be chopping up that neighborhood so it's represented by 4 different state representatives, for example. And Portage Park is actually a great example of that. I represent parts of Portage Park, but my colleague Will Gazzardi and my colleague Evadina Delgado also represent parts of Portage Park. So there people will use the term gerrymandering, but there are specific reasons why we don't have electoral districts that are perfect boxes that have to do with ensuring representation as is laid out in the state constitution and other statutes.
Thank you for explaining that in greater detail. It definitely gerrymandering is definitely always a topic of concern, and having you shed some more light on it definitely makes a big difference. So thank you so much, Lindsay. Aside from new leadership and new districts, we've also moved into 102 General Assembly, 102 General Assembly with new members and new committee assignments. Can you tell us about what committees you've been assigned to and what that means for your constituents? And some may not even know what committees are. So maybe providing a little color on that too.
Yeah. So we are at the beginning of the legislative session for 2021. And in a normal world, we would be in Springfield Tuesday through Thursday from about mid-January through the end of May. And it's a lot of legislative work gets done during that period. And most of the legislative work happens in committees. So every bill that is going to eventually, if it's successful, move to the House floor, where every member of the General Assembly will get to vote yes or no. First, it has to go through a committee process. And committees are subject matter committees, and they have chairs and they have vice chairs. So we'll run through my committees and give some examples. So human services, that's a huge bucket. And that's something that's very important to me. And I am the vice chair of that committee for this 102nd General Assembly. So any bill that's going to move related to human services is going to come through the committee. And that's where you hear from witnesses, you hear from people who these bills affect the most. So you might hear from families who are participating in human services. You might hear from workers who work at Reed Mental Health Center, just for an example, which is in the 19th House District, and they will talk about where this bill came from, why it's so important, or why it's a horrible bill and you should vote no. And that's where the real debate happens in committee. So it's a really important process. And where legislators are assigned for committee says a lot. It's a statement about what's important to the legislator, and also about what's important to the residents of the district. So for me, human services, housing, which is a brand new committee in Springfield that some of us were advocating for, including Representative Delia Ramirez, who's one of the gurus of housing in the General Assembly. I am on the K through 12 education committee. It's called K through 12 curriculum and policy. And I was on that last year. So anything related to K through 12 education, minus the budgeting part, because there's a separate appropriations committee for that, will come through this committee. Things related to teachers, students, length of school day, if we're doing a good enough job serving our kids with special needs, which we're not. So we'll have really important conversations in that committee. Police and fire is another committee I'm on, which it's a new committee for this General Assembly, but it's a new committee that used to be there in the not too distant past. We actually had a fire committee and a police committee. And that's really important to me because in this House district, we have a lot of current and retired first responders, police and fire, and including some of the suburbs. Finally, I think this is the last one, public safety appropriations. So that is a committee where we do budgeting. So how the money flows related to the public safety agencies and programs that we run here in Illinois. So that will include the Illinois State Police, the Illinois Department of Corrections. It will also include how our money is allocated, our state money, to violence intervention programs. Things like, you might have heard of oh, the name is escaping me, but street intervention programs like ceasefire. That's what it is. So when that's just an example of a violence intervention program, but we look at all those things and have very in-depth conversations in appropriations committees about where does it make sense to invest our dollars and where does it not.
That's great. Thank you for explaining that. And then what other big bills do you anticipate legislators will be working on this session, and what bills will you be carrying yourself?
Wow, we could talk a lot about this. We have a backlog because we did not have a normal legislative session during the pandemic. We were there for 4 days in May, but we had a very limited agenda related to passing a budget and providing COVID relief. So there's a lot of pent up excitement. For me, I'll talk a little bit about the bills that I am leading, or carrying is a word we use, first. And this is really exciting because I've been in a year and a half, but nothing about the last year has been normal. Haven't even had a normal legislative session. The bills that I'm leading, and there might be about 16 of them, which I've been told it's a pretty big bite to take. But that's why I'm here, to pass bills that are important for people in the 19th House District. So it's hard for me to have a limited number of bills. Let's see. I have a bunch of bills that are related to ensuring accessible and affordable mental health care for people and families. And sort of related to that, a handful of bills related to developmental disabilities and making sure that we are being as inclusive as possible in Illinois and providing full opportunities. I have another handful of bills that are related to support for workers, in making sure workers and other people have fiscal stability. And then there's some other bills related to making sure victims of crime have the support that they need. Let's see, some of these bill ideas, and this is the point, this is why we do outreach and build relationships in our communities, come from residents of the district. And I'll give you a few examples of that. So a bill related to workers and fiscal stability that's really important to me, that really came out of the pandemic, is a bill that would, let's see, sometimes it's hard to talk about policy in a way that isn't wonky. It's a bill that would say that, okay, here's the problem. We have people that are receiving unemployment benefits. We have a lot of people right now. And as unfortunately too many of you have experienced, we have some fraudulent cases, but we also have people that receive letters in the mail from IDS saying, whoops, we overpaid you, you owe us $10,000. Literally, people in our district are receiving these letters, and these are people that have been struggling to access unemployment in the first place, who are not working. We are all in a crisis. I can't even imagine what it's like to get that letter in the mail. So what is a remedy? One of the remedies is that if somebody receives that overpayment letter because IDS made a mistake and it had nothing to do with fraud, it's just that IDS is overloaded and they screwed up and paid someone too much, I feel very strongly that that person shouldn't have to pay that back. It should actually be the state that pays it back. And that will also double as an incentive for IDS to do a better, more accurate job. So that's a bill that came from the experience of residents here in the 19th district, and I'm really excited about getting it across the finish line. I've worked pretty closely with the LSC, or local school council, of Vaughn Occupational High School right in the district in Portage Park. And from from pretty close to day one and made a great connection with the principal and the local school council. And they brought to me a tremendous bill idea that would expand opportunities for our young people with disabilities when they come out of high school. Because at this moment in time, there's a cliff, we call it a cliff of support for young people with disabilities, in particular developmental and intellectual disabilities, that we do a pretty good job in our public high schools. Kids can stay in school till their 22nd birthday and do vocational training and get the supports that they need. But our colleges, our community colleges really aren't set up to give young people what they need as they're trying to make the next step. And so that's a bill I'm extremely excited about. I know I'm just looking at the clock.
Yeah.
So we're gonna sort of make sure we're covering
on that note, there was a question in the chat we'll ask. It's a really quick one. The bills you mentioned for accessible and affordable healthcare, what group did you say that they were focused on, and what was it, the people who were furloughed or lower income residents?
Okay, let me make sure I understand this question.
Yeah, go for it.
So the bills that I'm leading are actually, in terms of mental health, are related to young people and mental health. But that doesn't mean we don't have a lot of great bills that are going to be moving that I am going to jump on and support and co-sponsor and get them across the finish line, that are for people who have been furloughed or lower income residents. In the governor's budget address, he maintained, so his initial budget plan is to maintain mental health and substance abuse funding. I am filing a bill related to ensuring that first responders have access to mental health. And there's a lot of barriers, including stigma and fear of repercussions related to first responders accessing mental health. There's another bill I talked to Thresholds about today. So there's going to be a lot under that umbrella, and I'm going to make sure we give you that feedback on our social media and in our newsletters.
You got a lot of thumbs up, including in the chat, but you got a lot of thumbs up on Facebook Live for that, the bills that you just mentioned for the first responders and the police, and focusing on the mental health for them. So I guess considering the time, and you're doing a lot, Lindsay, so this could be a 4-hour, we can move this to be 4 hours, but of course, that's not possible right now. So are there any other bills you're not the lead sponsor on, but hope to see get past this session?
Yeah, a lot. One of the biggest ones is the Clean Energy Jobs Act. And that is it's a big bill. So it's going to be a more experienced member that's going to lead that. Ann Williams, Representative Ann Williams, and Senator Christina Castro are leading that in partnership. And it's a long overdue bill that would move Illinois towards clean energy. And it would do it in a way that creates green jobs, which is something that we desperately need. Illinois actually is a leader in green jobs, which is not something I knew until last year. But we need to keep moving and make sure we back away from dirty energy. And there's a huge advocacy community behind this effort. So many of my colleagues are supportive of the Clean Energy Jobs Act. So it's really a matter of making sure people's political will is on the record and getting it across the finish line this year, because we really cannot wait for it anymore. I'll talk about one more thing that is kind of bigger stuff that I'm really excited about: ethics reform. We've heard a lot about that, and we've had some little bitty ethics bills pop up along the way. Soon after I started in this role, we passed a ethics reform bill in 2019, right after one of my colleagues was indicted. Right, sometimes it takes a public incident like that. I don't think it should have to at all, but there's a lot of political will for ethics reform. And just to give you a few examples of things that I think need to be in an ethics reform package. If you are a state legislator and you resign, I do not think it should be legal for you to become a lobbyist the next day. And it currently is. And many states around the country have a waiting period of a year, 6 months, 2 years. So I'm confident that we are going to be passing something like that. We just have to get agreement on what is that appropriate window of time. We also have a legislative inspector general in the state of Illinois. Unfortunately, it's a part-time position, which I think should be a full-time position. And there is a legislative ethics, it's either called a commissioner or task force, and it's made up of legislators. And in order for the inspector general to move forward with an ethics investigation, the body, which is made up of legislators, has to say it's okay. And to me, there's something wrong there. There's something fundamentally wrong. If we should have full trust in our legislative inspector general, and it shouldn't take an okay by a legislator to investigate something that has risen to the top as an issue. Let's see. I want to make sure we're getting some questions.
Sure, from the chat, especially on Facebook, because those came in pretty early. Quick question about the criminal justice reform bill that came up in the chat, and I'm going to pull that up here in just a second. Bear with me as I pull that up. Hang on here, just checking in to see where that is. Hang on 1 second.
Yeah, we want to get to that. Well, I'll just start talking a little bit about the criminal justice. Yep. Okay, I see.
So yeah, why are lawmakers allowed to vote on a bill that is 800 plus pages and only given an hour to vote on it? Recently, the police reform bill, bills should not be voted on without the lawmakers' full knowledge of that bill.
Yeah, that's a good question that has been out there and asked in the public domain. So just for people that might not be familiar, and I'm glad that I wanted to bring this up. So this question is about a very large criminal justice reform bill that passed the House and Senate on the last day or two of the 101st General Assembly. So new people got sworn in for the 102nd General Assembly. So this was sort of the last bill of the prior 2-year cycle. And it was a big bill related to creating a more rehabilitative criminal justice system, providing more support for victims of crime. And there was a lot in there about how can we hold our law enforcement officers more accountable. And it was controversial. And this is a bill that I got a lot of feedback on from both sides. So the specific question is about, this is a really big bill. Why were lawmakers allowed to vote on it like very quickly? And to that, I would say, like, to the outsider, it might seem like we did it very quickly, but actually the Senate had been holding hearings since the summer over all of the components of the bill. They were actually virtual hearings, and House members who were on those committees were invited. And so there was a lot of testimony over the months. And a lot of the discussion had already been had. I will say that something that I think is problematic and just very frustrating is that we were there in Springfield in person, and normally we would have more of the ability to interface with stakeholders and lobbyists, which in part is going to include law enforcement, but lobbyists weren't allowed because of the pandemic to be kind of with us. So a lot of it was happening on the cell phone. And so for me, it meant that I was on the phone with local chiefs of police. It meant I was on the phone with a lot of the labor groups across Illinois. I was on the phone with people like the ACLU of Illinois. And you'd be surprised like how much can get done in a very short period of time. I was in in-depth conversations with people on this bill, and it's not perfect, but I'm proud that through conversations we were able to make some pretty significant changes in the bill related to preserving collective bargaining rights, related to not having qualified immunity in the bill, which is something that law enforcement had very big concerns over. There were concerns that law enforcement officers would just be able to be sued all the time. And then other discussions on the phone with law enforcement, with lobbyists while we were in Springfield were about unfunded mandates and making sure that we weren't saying that local governments would be punished for not having body cameras right away. And part of that is about kicking out the effective date for things. So we ended cash bail. We made a plan to end cash bail with this bill. And what that means is when you have cash bail, it means when you're detained pre-trial in county jail, the judge sets a bond amount, and if you have the money, you can leave. And if you don't have the money, you have to spend your pretrial time in jail. Many of us think that's fundamentally unfair. Many of us think that that leads to people being able to buy their way out of jail. And we think those decisions should be made based on risk to public safety and risk of not showing up to court again. So Illinois put a plan in place. And because of the conversations that we had during those months of hearings leading up to the bill, but also in Springfield, mostly using the cell phone and with our colleagues, that implementation date for when Illinois is going to end cash bail is 2 years from now. So I know a lot of us fought hard for changes in that bill. I think there's going to be some more changes coming, but we got a better product.
Thank you.
That's a good question. I appreciate it.
Definitely. So would you like me to ask the questions now, since we're coming close to the end of our session here, unfortunately?
Yeah, I do. And we can plan to go a little past 6:30.
Okay, great.
Because we always want to have time for questions.
Absolutely. So with that said, then can you talk at all about the budget and fiscal stability? It's obviously making a comeback from COVID and stabilizing us is very important right now.
Yeah, it's incredibly important. It's having a budget in place is everything else I just talked about. The budget is foundational to it. We can't really do anything if we don't have a budget. And you are going to see some of this in the media because the governor did his annual budget address yesterday. And that is typical. So the budget address happens in mid-February, and it's a starting point for a conversation. The governor gets to lay out a budget plan. It shows where his administration's priorities are, where they're not, and then the House and the Senate gets to react to it. We have many hearings, and an actual budget has to be passed by May 31st. So that's a big thing we do in our regular session. So a quick summary of the governor's budget plan, which again is just the starting point for conversation. I guarantee you the final budget is not going to look like what he rolled out yesterday. And full disclosure, I think it's a good starting point. I would say his budget plan prevents further harm and does a good job protecting the most vulnerable in Illinois, which right now during our multiple crises we need. The budget it's essentially flat from last year. So to be specific, public higher education in Illinois, that's a big state line item. It's flat. They're not getting an increase. So the overall budget is flat, but there are a few entities that are getting increases, like the Illinois Department of Employment Security, like the Department of Child and Family Services, out of recognition that IDES is not exactly functional. And I think that's just known. It's not. We get many, many calls in our office. And IDES needs to be functional for the people in the state of Illinois to thrive. Our child welfare system, when that doesn't function, children die, and that is just completely unacceptable. This budget has us making our full pension payment. This budget that the governor introduced does not raise the state income tax, which I know many of us were kind of waiting with bated breath to see what the initial plan on that was going to be. Now, how is that even possible, right? Like, how are we holding the line? Well, a big reason that's possible is because the proposed budget closes a lot of corporate loopholes, about $1 billion worth of corporate loopholes. That's not something that a lot of Republicans like, but from the governor's point of view, and I am certainly more in alignment with the governor on this, this is a time where we have to make sure people can access the critical needs, critical services that they have, make sure their basic needs are met. And so I think closing corporate loopholes for for-profit companies is actually it makes a lot of sense in this moment. So those are some of the basics. I will just share one thing that I know I am not happy with, and that is the proposed budget fails to fund the still relatively new evidence-based education funding formula in Illinois. We didn't make our full payment when we did the budget last May, and the full payment's supposed to be $350 million. The governor didn't have it in there this time either. So I know that's something that many of us will be advocating for.
That's great. Thank you, Lindsay. So some of the other questions that came in are from Jamie. Good evening. Regarding our next vaccine stage 1C, why weren't higher education faculty included in the K through 12 workers?
Yeah, that's a really great.
And, you know, I think this is a very relevant to COVID question. And I think I saw some others very similar in the chat. I briefly glanced. You know, feel free to go ahead and answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm going to take the question literally, why? Because the powers that be did not prioritize. I have been in conversation with community college faculty and staff. Wright College is in my district, so this is something that I have communicated to leaders about, how I do think that this should be a 1B priority population. We have a lot of kinks to work out with the vaccine access, but just to step back and do a little 101, like the CDC puts out guidelines, and then local governments have a fair amount of discretion. The governor has a fair amount of discretion, but then when you go under the governor, our county, Cook, and the city of Chicago also has discretion. So, you know, I'm going to take the question literally. Leaders did not prioritize, and there's right now there's not enough vaccine to go around, but this is a population that I do think should be a priority, and I've communicated that on the record. I do think that we have so many essential workers, and we really need to do a better job of getting this vaccine to flow, because this is a huge part of the solution to our public health and economic crisis that we're in. But if that question was asked in the spirit of supporting higher education faculty and workers, especially community college, because we have right in the district, I just want to communicate my support for that really important work that is often underpaid, that happens every day, whether remote or in person.
Yeah, thank you. Just a little tidbit about Wright. My father attended Wright and new to the country, and took on a welding program there, and learned how to weld, and started a whole business from it. So I have an emotional connection to you mentioning Wright College, and thank you again for that answer. I hope you got the answer you were looking for, Jamie. Do you get feedback from constituents about bills or public happenings? What kind of feedback do you get?
We get a lot, and we love it. And sometimes people have questions. Sometimes people are supportive of what we're doing. Sometimes people are very unsupportive. But that's a part of democracy, and it's really important for us to hear from people. Things heat up when certain pieces of legislation are on the table. So when I'm about to go to Springfield and I'm looking closely at bills, or if I'm in my Human Services Committee hearing, that is a time where our inbox will be blowing up, and sometimes our phones, with people across the district calling in to share their point of view on things. Sometimes they are what I call action alert emails, which are sort of form emails that people send in because advocacy groups have sent out a template, and sometimes they're real personal. And I will say, like, as a point of encouraging people to reach out, the more personal, the better. It lets me know that you really care about whatever issue it is, and that issue really affects your life. So we get a lot of feedback, and we really like it.
How do you receive that feedback? Is it through email, text, phone calls?
Mostly email. Sometimes Facebook messages, and to be honest, that can be a little difficult to manage, and hard to track. And we try, because we think it's really important to track. So email is great, but we also get phone calls, and there's been stretches of time where we have not been in the office because of the pandemic, and so we route our office phone to a staff member's cell phone. Sometimes people tag me on Facebook, which is,
I might be one of those offenders.
we all have our personal preference. I find that a difficult way to take in information, because you see Facebook, you might see it when you're in the middle of doing something else. And to me, communication that somebody took the time to write, even if it's a Facebook message or tag, it's really important. And so I want to make sure we get that information. We work really hard to respond to everything, because, like, just at the end of the day, this is about democracy and people's voices being heard, even if we don't agree on everything. And so knowing that I represent 108,000 people, knowing that many of those people have no idea who I am or what a state rep does, like, that's just the reality. I hope to change that. When I get a communication from somebody, my team wants to, we want to support that. We want to respond in a way that will encourage somebody to reach out again.
And you definitely do, Lindsay. Your office is extremely accessible and available. The fact that you even check the tags, and I'll clarify what a tag is for William. A tag is, I will put in the chat of someone's status or something I see, and I'll put the @ symbol and tag Lindsay LaPointe. And so that's normally how, if I see something that I think of for Lindsay, I'll tag her. And the fact that you even check that is amazing.
Totally. And actually, there was one today. I'll give an example. Our friend Stacy is the manager of Edelweiss Restaurant in Norridge, and myself, Senator Martwick, and some other folks have partnered with Stacy over the last year. She has a huge heart and is really all about making sure people have what they need. She's got a great presence on Facebook, and today she tagged me and some people because she needed to locate an open gym in Norridge where her sons and some other people could play basketball. So she didn't email us. She tagged me on Facebook.
Did you respond to her?
Well, I saw that some other people responded and they pointed her in the right direction.
That's good.
So I was like, they got it.
Glad you got what you needed.
You got what you needed.
So it's 6:39, and we're going to be closing out here. And the last thing to close us out is that I recently heard this question on another Facebook Live, and I'd really like to use it to close us out. Tell us one thing that's keeping you inspired these days that you haven't mentioned in tonight's discussion. Obviously, you are inspired by many things, but what do you feel you're inspired by?
That's a good question. I'm going to ask you too. So while I answer, think about what inspires you. And this is a great thing to think about every day, every week, especially during this hard time, to just have gratitude and reflect on what inspires us. So for me right now, and if you follow my Facebook, you've seen this, a really inspiring thing is a collaborative work group in the Jefferson Park neighborhood, a collaborative work group on homelessness. And it's a handful of neighborhood groups, my office, the Jefferson Park Chamber of Commerce, that's come together to form a group that helps connect people in homelessness right in our area, right at the Jefferson Park Transit Center, with the support and services that they need. And that's an uphill battle, especially during the pandemic, but we're a new group. We started around September and we're gelling. And during this cold snap in particular, it's our role to kind of share some stories about what we're doing and let other people in various communities on the far northwest side know that some of your neighbors are really struggling. Here's how you can help. Here's how you can help and keep people alive. And some of that means driving people to warming centers, paying for a motel for a few nights during this cold snap. And the long-term goal, of course, is to connect people to stable housing. And we're actually having some success with that.
That's amazing. How can we as a community help that effort and support?
Following the Jefferson Park Working Group on Homelessness Facebook page is a great thing to do. And we actually recently created a way to donate under the umbrella of Jefferson Park Forward, which is one of our neighborhood groups. So they're technically our fiscal agent, and there's actually a way to donate. And we have been using that money to pay for hand warmers, to pay for coats, to even pay for motels. And I just heard today that the 16th District Police Station, which is right in the heart of Jefferson Park, right near the train station, we liaison with them because there's connection there, of course. We want to provide people support and services instead of arresting them. And I know that the officers at the 16th District feel the same way. They're going to do a coat drive for our group this weekend, and we're really excited about that.
That's fantastic. And I look forward to more discussions with you about how I can support that initiative.
Thank you.
And what drives I can do. And, you know, obviously you are one of the most inspirational local officials I've met in a very long time. I say that obviously because in the chat I'm getting like, go Lindsay, Lindsay's amazing. So I'm not the only one. that is inspired by you, Lindsay. So one, you inspire me. And two, something that inspires me is your initiatives for individuals with disabilities. I have a disabled aunt, and I take her to various locations around Skokie for her to unplug and relax, and us to bond. So accessibility really inspires me. Creating more accessible spaces. One of the things that I'm working on is a directory for spaces that are accessible for individuals who are wheelchair bound. So essentially it's an app. So I love the innovation and the creativity of this organization that created an app that you can search accessible spaces near you. And there is companies like Jewel on it, shopping centers. And I really want to be on the front end of those discussions with our community and getting businesses and other spaces on this app that are accessible for those that are wheelchair bound. So it may seem like a small thing, but for some who are not sure if a space is accessible for them, whether it's the spacing, the spaciousness of getting around, or bathrooms that have automatic doors or ADA bathrooms, this is all part of that app. And hopefully the movement will continue to creating accessible spaces for individuals with disabilities. So that is definitely something that inspires me, is that there is a lot of innovation with creating accessible spaces and the movement that exists. So thank you for asking me that question.
Thank you for sharing that. We've taken some huge strides for making everything in life accessible, but we still have a long way to go. And right at this moment, because of all the snow on the ground, it's a reminder of how difficult it is for people with mobility issues to just go about their day to day.
Definitely. And it's something as simple as like, is there a step? For instance, we don't think about, some restaurants have chairs that are bolted to the ground, and that makes it difficult for individuals who are in a wheelchair to get on the chairs. Okay, and I see that there was something in the chat. Did you want to make that public?
Is it the question about the 60th district? Oh, yeah. I see. I answered the question about where is the coat drive, or what are the details related to this, the 16th district. I sent it to just the panelists, so that's not very helpful.
That's why I mentioned it.
Thank you, Mary.
You're welcome.
We're all still adjusting to this weird world of Zoom. Well, we certainly didn't want to go over 75 minutes because no one wants to look at a screen for that long. But for those of you who joined us, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Always reach out to our office. My team is here ready to assist. And Mary, thank you so much. I see more of these Facebook Lives in our future because there's so many things that we could talk about.
Definitely.
And I love what you're doing. I want to do a Facebook Live more about the Assyrian community. So I see that in our future too.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. You've been a huge help to us. And for those with language barriers, if they were on this call, I'm sure they'd say thank you to you for all the work that you do.
It's our pleasure. It's foundational.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to sign off, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one of these in about a month. Have a great night, everybody.
Good night.